Hey guys, thank you for checking out my first YouTube project. In this video and the next, we're going to cover how I built this vanity for my fiance. Thanks for checking it out. Now here I'm laying out the legs that I got from Lowe's. One thing, if you do pick these up, make sure that you really review them while you're in the store because they're not all the same. Even the ones that I picked after reviewing them in the store, when I got them back home, I saw that they still weren't exactly the same. As long as they're not sitting right next to each other on a table, you really don't notice, but still something to look out for. Now here I'm marking out for the dominoes on the legs. That little T-ruler from Incra is absolutely awesome for this. I used it so much on this project. This is the best 20 bucks I ever spent, 25 bucks, something like that. Now here I'm actually doing the mortises with the domino. You'll notice here I flick the switch to make the second and third mortises a little bit bigger. This gives you a little more leeway. That way you have one tight one for reference and the rest are a little bit looser. Here we're just doing the same mortises in the aprons here. Now you could easily do this with pocket holes. I know everybody doesn't have a domino. Pocket holes would be easy, very easy to do this with. Now one thing I usually always forget to do is open my clamps up before I do the glue up. This time I actually remembered, so it was so much simpler that way. Now I don't show putting the two sides together, but it's pretty much the same deal. Just smack some dominoes into the mortises, some glue, and clamp it together. That's done, and this is actually the next day now. These are the tabletop clips that I have on hand, and I just wanted to give them a shot, even though this was a plywood top that is pretty stable and won't expand and contract. I wanted to give them a shot, so here we are. Now I measured how deep these needed to be from the tabletop, and I planned from the beginning to use the Domino machine to cut the slots for that. You could also use a biscuit cutter if you have one. Otherwise you can cut slots into aprons before you glue them up with a table saw or a router or something like that. Here I am again with that T-ruler from Incra. So awesome, so awesome. Now these are some leveling glides that I got from the store. I wasn't sure if the legs were going to be all exactly the same and how level the floor was that they were going to go on. So I got them just in case. It turned out we didn't really need them once we got this installed, but still good to have there. Plus, honestly, I wasn't sure that this was going to be super square because I'm still learning some of this stuff. So now here I'm using some of the 2P10 CA gel glue, which is great. I get that I got that from Woodcraft actually, but you can order it from Amazon. And the little activator is great because it makes it set right away, which is so convenient. Here's the finished table now. Now we're going to get started on the top with the electrical stuff. Now keep in mind, I am not an electrician. I did my research before this project, and I've done a lot of little electronics projects and stuff over the years since I was a kid. So if you do this, do it at your own risk, first of all, and look it up and make sure you're doing it right. Because if you don't, you could burn your house down, you could kill yourself with electrocution. Be careful. It's not that hard, but you just got to make sure you're doing it right. One thing I did do on this was I used a very low draw LED light bulb for this project so that I knew I didn't have to use a super thick wire, because otherwise if you used incandescent bulbs or even fluorescent bulbs, the power draw would just be so much that you'd have to use really thick wiring and really know what you're doing. Now, at first I was smearing this epoxy on the light sockets themselves, but I had a lot of squeeze out, which was not super great. So what I found is if I just put a little bit in the holes for the sockets here, it was plenty to hold them and there was no squeeze out. They were pretty snug fit anyways, so there was really no reason to glob it on like I did for the first few. Here we're just hooking everything up. Again, I'm not really going into detail about how to wire this because you should do your own research. Again, I'm not an electrician, and if you do it wrong, like I said, you could burn your house down or hurt yourself. So definitely be careful anytime you're playing with something electrical like this. Now here I have these little mounting blocks that you can zip tie to. They're actually in the electrical department at Home Depot. And these were great because they allowed me to neaten up these wires so they weren't sticking out the back. And it's the first time I ever used them. I've known about them for a long time, never really had a use for them, and then went and used them for this, and they were actually really great. So. Now here for the back on the switch, I'd loop the cable a little bit to give it a little bit of strain relief. That way if it ever does get tugged on, it'll hopefully loosen itself from that mount there instead of pulling itself out of the back of the dimmer. Here I'm using the 2P10 gel glue and activator to make a quick jig to lift the mirror up and keep it straight while I glue it on. For stuff like this glue again is just awesome. Instant setting. I love having it in the shop. Now here I'm putting on a special glue called Mirror Mastic. It's definitely what the pros recommend for gluing mirrors down. You might be able to see that there's some little double-sided foam tape on there as well. That's because whenever you use a glue like this for mirrors, you want it to be supported while the mastic is drying. So they recommend it set over 24 hours, and I didn't want to leave the board there because I needed to move this off the table, so instead we use the double-sided tape. Also just as kind of a fail-safe to have two different mediums holding it onto the back here. Now the one thing about that mastic though is you really need to make sure it's not old. The first tube I bought from Home Depot had been sitting there apparently a couple of years, and so when I tried to squirt it out with the caulk gun, I was squeezing really hard, and basically it was the consistency of an eraser, so that wasn't good. So I had to go back and buy more and spend another $10 and all that fun stuff. So definitely check that. And they didn't have a date on the newer ones, so I made sure to get the latest batch number I could find in the store, and it ended up serving me pretty well. The batch number for this started with a 15. They still had some there that started with 12 and 13. I think the first one I bought was 12 from years ago. It even says right on the package that it's only good for a year on the shelf unopened. Here we're just screwing the base on, and then it's going to go get installed, and my fiance is going to love it. Learn something. I'm not a professional by any means, and every time I do something, I learn something, so I'm going to try to share that with you. So on this one I learned about putting hardwood trim or just solid wood trim on plywood for edge banding, and it worked out okay, but one thing I learned is if you're going to use the 23 gauge pin nailer, it's not really strong enough to hold it on there with a super tight glue line. At least in my experience with this project. Now I haven't really done that a whole lot before, so as I said, I learned that lesson. After this project, I helped a friend do the same thing on a tabletop that he was making, and that time we did glue it, and the glue lines are pretty much invisible other than the fact that the woods are contrasting. On this one, after I painted it, you can still see the seams there. Not a huge deal, but something to know for next time. The other thing I learned was that when you're using a 23 gauge pin nailer, on some like stain grade or clear coat projects, sometimes you don't need to fill the heads, because they're so small you can't even really notice them. I thought that was going to be the case in the paint grade project. I might fill in because they're so small. They do show up a very little bit. Probably nobody else will notice, but I see them, so next time I'm going to fill those holes. Next time, because I have to fill those holes, I might end up just using the 16 gauge. I'm going to need to fill the holes anyways. I was using the 23 gauge because I figured it's small, I won't need to fill the holes, but unfortunately I would have, or should have. Next time the 16 gauge brand nailer might have held the trim on a little bit better, and maybe made that glue line a little bit less noticeable. The other thing I could have done was maybe use a little bit more glue, and then another thing I did, which probably again wasn't good, was that right after I nailed them on and glued them on before the glue had finished drying, I went and tried to sand them flush with the aggressive mode on my sanders there, and it brought them flush, but I think it might have also pulled it away from the, opened up that joint a little bit basically. So next time I'll be a little more patient. I was trying to rush to get this done by Valentine's Day originally. Yeah. The other thing that I learned here too is that where the back wall here meets the sides, there's a seam there, and I was hoping that it wouldn't show up when the piece was painted, but again, it did. So next time if I saw that happen again, I'd probably caulk it before I painted it. Caulk it and wipe it down so it's nice and smooth and you can't really see a seam there. That would have been rather helpful, and I think it would have looked a little bit nicer. Other than that, the project came out great, and my fiance really loves it, and she has a place to sit and do her makeup now with great lighting. It's amazing sharing it on Facebook how many women were like, hey man, this is really great, you're so lucky, so if there's a woman in your life, you can make her one and she will be pleased. Again, if you made it this far, thanks for checking out the video. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up and share it and subscribe, and I'll be back with more projects for you. Thanks again.